Configuration files and related topics. Configuration files control many aspects of a Linux system. Everything from system startup to a web server to the look and feel of your environment are controlled by configuration files. And we've already touched on some of them and their function, but in this video we're going to see more configuration files and deal with related topics like environment variables and run levels. So let's get started. Let's start out with the basics of configuration files. There's two main types of configuration files. There's user configuration files and there's system configuration files. The user configuration files typically reside in the user's home directory. Examples include things like the .bashrc file or the .emacs file. Okay, these are examples of user configuration files. And the user can edit their own configuration files, and the alteration of those files will only affect their environment. When I change my .emacs file, that changes my Emacs preferences, but it doesn't mess with anybody else's Emacs preferences. We classify all these user configuration files together, commonly with the name .files, okay, because they start with that period. And these files are basically hidden, right? Like if we do an ls on our home directory, we don't even see these files because they start with a period. And if we do an ls-a, then we'll see them. Okay, so that's exactly what we want out of configuration files. We know where they are, we know how to edit them, but they're not in the way all the time. They don't show up every time we do a listing. Now, system configuration files, on the other hand, are located in the etc directory and its subdirectories. And these configuration files are not duplicated. There's not one for every user in the system. There's one system configuration file for a web server. There's one system configuration file for the file system tables and things like that. Okay? And only the super user, only the administrator, can edit these system configuration files, and that's because they affect everyone on the system. All right, so let's go out to the Linux screen and start looking at some of these configuration files and look at their formats and how to get them to do what we want them to do. So now let's take a look at some user configuration files. We're in my home directory here, so I'll just do an ls with the A option, and you'll see a whole bunch of user configuration files in here. Basically, everything that starts with a dot is one of these user configuration files, and you can pretty much tell what the configuration file controls just by its name. Okay, so the things that start with .bash here have to do with the bash shell. The things that start with .emacs have to do with the Emacs editor. The things that start with .gnome have to do with the GNOME environment, and so on. There's the Mozilla web browser, and you can see actually here that some of these things that are in blue here are not actually configuration files, but they're directories full of configuration files, and they're classified again just by what they configure. So all the stuff, all the web browser settings for Mozilla are in the .mozilla directory. Okay, and all the configuration files for the Sawfish window manager are in the .sawfish directory again. Okay, now you might be saying to yourself, well, wait, didn't a few videos ago, didn't you show us how to configure the Sawfish window manager through the graphical user interface, like through this main menu down here? And sure, I did. We went to Programs, we went to Settings, and we went into the Sawfish window manager, and we could alter any number of these things through the menu options. Okay, now that's perfectly valid, and if you say, well, I don't want to edit configuration files by hand, I'd rather use this user interface down here, that's perfectly valid. But if you're a system manager, a system administrator, then there's some real good reasons why you should know where these configuration files are and which ones control which things. Because say you're trying to give some settings, you're trying to give some configuration files to all the users in the system. Okay, they're all using the Sawfish window manager, and you want them to have some default settings so they can get, the full functionality out of that. Okay, well, instead of creating their account and then either giving them instructions on what to do or going to each account and going through those menu options, it's a lot easier to do some generic account, set it up the way you want, and then just copy all the configuration files that are related to what you're trying to accomplish, copy all those configuration files over to the user's directories, and then boom, they've got all those configuration files set. Okay, so these text files that hold all this information, it's a lot easier to copy those around than have to go to each single machine and go through the graphical user interface to set all these things that you want. Okay? Now that we're here talking about user configuration files, this would be a good time to step back and talk a little bit about environment variables. Environment variables basically keep track of the state of the system. Okay? Certain commands write to environment variables when they do something. Other commands read from environment variables, and then they make some output or act accordingly depending on the value of the environment variable. Let me try and make this a little bit more concrete for you. There's a command called env, and the env command will print out all your environment variables and their values. Okay, I'm going to pipe this through more because the list is going to be pretty long and I don't want it to scroll off the screen on us. Okay, so let me hit enter here and you'll see down the left hand side all these things over here in all capitals. These are the names of all the environment variables. Okay, and on the right side after the equal sign is the value of each environment variable. Now let's take one of these environment variables, let's take the PWD environment variable, and let's talk about it in pretty good detail. And I think you'll understand after that, so you'll get a general understanding of how environment variables work. Okay? Now first, let's go back and talk about the PWD command. Remember the PWD command? It prints your working directory. Okay? Now let's also talk about the CD command. The CD command changes your directory. But also the CD command writes to the PWD environment variable after it changes your directory, and it gives the PWD environment variable the value of the new directory that you're now in. Okay? So if I CD'd down into my scripts directory, for instance, okay, the CD command would change me into the scripts directory, and it would also change the value of the PWD environment variable to be home Perry scripts. Okay? That's how the CD command works. It changes your directory and then it writes to the PWD environment variable. Now let's talk about the PWD command. The PWD command prints your working directory, but how does it know that? It knows that because it goes to the PWD environment variable and it finds out its value, it gets that value, and then it prints that value out to the screen. Okay, so instead of typing the PWD command, you could just type end, and look at the PWD environment variable. That would be the exact same answer because that's all the PWD command does, is it looks at the PWD environment variable. Okay, so the CD command writes to that variable, the PWD command reads from that variable, and that's how it all works. And that's the function of that variable. Okay. And there's other commands too. There's a hostname command, and all the hostname command does is look at the hostname environment variable and print it out. Okay, and the name of my host is Nugget1. Okay, and there's lots of other environment variables. If I hit spacebar here to scroll down the screen, you can see the display environment variable. We talked about that a couple of videos ago when we were getting an X terminal from one machine to display on a different machine. We saw how to set the display variable to make that happen. Okay, there is also a shell variable which lists your current shell. There is a home directory. That's my home directory. That's the home variable. Okay, there's a terminal variable. It's called term. Okay, this one's actually kind of important because sometimes the things will mess up when you're using like a telnet connection, like a plain text-based connection. Okay, and in those cases, when you're using like a plain text-based connection, check your term variable and make sure the term is set to something like VT100 or VT220 or something like that. And these are names for archaic terminals back in the day, before there were mice and before there were like scroll bars and stuff over here on the right, things like that, back when there were just plain text terminals. Because that's what your telnet window is, right? It's just a plain text terminal. There's no mouse functionality, there's no scroll bars or anything. And so these types of terminals should have the term variable set to something like VT100. And I'll show you how to change these environment variables in a couple minutes. And then finally, the last environment variable I want to talk about is probably the most important environment variable, the path environment variable. The path environment variable tells the operating system where to look for executable programs. So when I type some command, like say I'm down here at the command line, and I type, PWD, for instance, okay? Well, this is a command, right? This is an executable command. Well, what the operating system does is it says, okay, you want to run the PWD command, I'm going to look in the bin directory and see if there's one in there to run. And if there's none in there to run, then it's going to look in user bin, and it's going to see if there's one in there to run. And if it's not in there, then it's going to look in user bin X11 and so on. Okay? Now, until it finds it, it's going to keep going through this list until it finds a PWD command to execute. And it goes all the way through the list and it doesn't find one, it'll say, sorry, I can't find a PWD command. Even if there is one out there, if the directory that it's in is not in your path, it won't find it. Okay, so I referred many times throughout these videos, and I've shown you also how to set your path so that all the correct directories are in it. If you put in some new piece of software and you put it in some different directory, you better add that to your path. Okay, and another thing to note here is that everything that it does, whenever it looks for a command, it looks in order. Okay, it doesn't skip around here. So it's going to, this is the most important directory in some sense. This is the second most important directory. This is next, and so on. Okay, so if you create some program and you put it in home Perry bin, right? And because it's for you, it's not for anybody else, okay? But if